Now we move on to the muscle contraction overview, and this is where a stimulus triggers the release of ACH into the end plate. The ACH then enables depolarization within the sarcolemma, which then moves through the muscle fiber via the T-tubules. As depolarization happens, it releases calcium ions from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. At this point, actin filaments are in the binding site for the myosin heads. They are covered with troponin and tropomycium. The calcium binds with the troponin and the tropomycium, which deforms their shape and allows the actin filaments to attach to the myosin heads. The myosin heads then and the actin filaments then form a cross bridge, which drags the actin filaments along. The myosin then gets rehydrolyzed due to the ATP and releases the first actin filament and bonds to another one. This repeated contraction drags the actin filaments, which pulls the Z line closer together, and they are binded together. So overall, the sarcomere shortens as a whole and the muscle. We are now moving on to the neuromuscular junction. And this neuromuscular junction is also known as the myoneural junction, which is the site of chemical communication between a nerve fibre and a muscle cell. A nerve fibre divides into different terminal branches. Each terminal ends on a region of a muscle fibre called the end plate. Embedded in the end plate there are thousands of receptors. Upon stimulation by nerve impulse, the terminal then releases a chemical neurotransmitter, ACH, from the vesicles. The ACH binds with the receptors, which leads to depolarization, and the pathway opens and sodium ions are then able to get into the end plate. Now we are moving on to the sliding filament theory, and this is an explanation of how our muscles contract to produce a force. It must start with a stimulus, which your sensory organs detect within the environment. As you have detected the stimulus, the information is sent via a sensory neuron to the brain. The brain then quickly decides on a response. During this response, the electrical impulses travel down the myelinated myelin till it reaches the vesicle. Within the vesicle there is ACH stored, and it is then released to go via the presynaptic membrane till it travels across the synapse till it reaches the receptor site. The electrical impulse then carries on down through the T-tubules to reach the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is where the calcium ions are stored. The calcium then binds to the troponin and the tropomycium. This then changes the shape and is able to connect to the myosin heads. The myosin is then hydrolyzed from the ATP, so it connects to the actin filaments, forming a cross bridge. This will then pull the actin filaments, which causes the Z line to move and the sarcomere to shorten. But when the myosin then takes more ATP, it releases one actin, then attaches to the next one, and it is a repeated cycle. Types of muscle contraction. An isometric contraction is when the muscle does not change length or shape. This type of muscle contraction is good to help maintain strength. Types of muscle contraction. An isometric contraction is when the muscle does not change. Types of muscle contraction. An isometric contraction is when the muscle does not change length or shape. This type of muscle contraction is very good to help maintain strength. In a sporting example, a clear and evident example of an isometric contraction would be a handstand. This is because in the static phase of this skill, the muscles are contracted but do not move and do not change shape or length. Next one is an isotonic contraction. This is when the muscle length does change and is usually a method of muscular exercise, as they are repeated contractions, hence why they can change lengths. A sporting example of this would be long jump, as your muscles can change length depending on what phase you are in that skill. Next, we are looking at a concentric contraction, and this is when the muscle length shortens during a contraction. This is an effective muscle contraction in gaining muscle mass. A visual representation of this muscle contraction is, imagine yourself doing a bicep curl with a weight. As your arm moves from the downwards phase, so your arm is fully extended, towards the ceiling, this is when your muscles are contracting concentrically.